In the spring of 1849, Charleston was a city of wealth, refinement, and secrets. Behind polished doors and the civility of its elite, a darkness grew, unnoticed, deliberate, lethal. 17 men, all of influence, all dead under mysterious circumstances. Official records were sealed, witnesses silenced, and yet every death followed a pattern, precise, methodical, and horrifying. And then, an entry unlike the rest. Formula holds. The tincture leaves no sign upon the throat. Death appears serene. This is the story of Elias Finch, the barber who killed quietly, invisibly, and whose hand shaped death itself. What you are about to see is what the city tried to forget. Before we continue with the hidden life of Elias Finch and the quiet terror that swept Charleston's upper class, take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the stories history tried to erase. Tell us where you're listening from, and now, let's return to 1849, Charleston, South Carolina. In the spring of 1849, the city glittered like a jewel of the southern coast. Ships from Liverpool and Havana crowded its harbor. The air was thick with salt, magnolia, and coal smoke. Along East Bay Street, the carriages of planters and merchants rolled over cobblestones, while beneath the shade of palmetto trees, gentlemen tipped their hats to veiled ladies. Charleston was wealthy, almost too wealthy. The trade of rice and indigo had made men into monarchs, but beneath the marble facades and polished manners lay an unspoken cruelty. The wealth of the city rested on backs that would never be invited to sit at its tables. Within this world of appearances, every class had its role. The planter commanded, the merchant calculated, the servant obeyed. And among them all stood Elias Finch, a man who listened, who remembered, and who held the city's trust in the palm of his steady hand. His shop stood at 31 Meeting Street, a narrow two-story structure pressed between an apothecary and a tailor. Above the door hung a modest sign, E. Finch, Barber Toiletry. Inside, the air smelled of bay rum, camphor, and oiled wood. A great leather chair, imported from Philadelphia, occupied the center of the room like a throne. Light filtered through the front window and glinted upon the polished razors arranged on the counter, each aligned with military precision. Finch's hands, pale from years without sun, were famous for their steadiness. His voice rarely rose above a whisper. To the city's gentlemen he was indispensable, to a few he was a confidant, to most he was invisible. He served Charleston's finest men, Judge Percival Lawton, Colonel Henry Shaw, Mr. Samuel Armitage of the First Bank. They trusted him with their throats, and Finch never betrayed the appearance of a man who might wish them harm. He listened as they spoke of investments, politics, scandal. He never interrupted, never judged. The razor glided across their skin like a surgeon's scalpel. Behind his calm eyes he studied them, how they moved, how they trembled, how their blood pulsed beneath the surface of their necks. Barbers in Charleston were more than tradesmen. They were confessors, physicians, and undertakers of vanity. In a city without public bathhouses, they cleaned, dressed wounds, and mixed ointments. Men spoke freely while the blade hovered near their throat, and Finch heard everything. Debts, secrets, infidelities. He recorded them all in his ledgers, written in the same neat hand that listed appointments and prices. The entries looked ordinary at first glance. Colonel Shaw, impatient, requires hot towel, tremor in left hand. Mr. Armitage, perspiration excessive, complains of palpitations. Judge Lawton, indigestion, trusts entirely. Over time the notes grew more technical, as if the barber were not keeping a client list but conducting an experiment. Elias Finch was born in 1810, the son of a dockhand and a laundress. His father died of fever when Elias was 9, and he was apprenticed to a free black barber named Thomas Reed, who kept a shop near Broad Street. Reed was a meticulous man who believed the razor was an instrument of order, a discipline as much as a trade. He taught the boy to mix oils, to stop bleeding with alum and vinegar, and to read medical pamphlets sent from London. By 16, Finch could shave a man blindfolded, By 20, he was known for his precision. He opened his own shop in 1835 and quickly built a clientele among the city's merchant class. He was quiet, efficient, and discreet. His silence earned him access to the private lives of Charleston's elite. Yet what began as a craft became something else. Finch was drawn to the fragility of the human body, the way a nick, a pulse, or a single drop of fluid could determine life or death. In the late 1840s, yellow fever crept through Charleston streets like a ghost. Houses were marked with black ribbons. The bells of St. Philip's tolled day and night. Doctors bled the sick, purged them, or prayed over them. None could explain why some recovered and others simply slipped away. Finch, ever observant, began recording symptoms: the dullness behind the eyes, the trembling hand, the confusion before collapse. To him, illness was not tragedy, but pattern, an invisible code waiting to be deciphered. When his wife, Margaret Finch, sister to Judge Loughton, died in childbirth in the winter of 1848, something in him hardened beyond repair. Her death was recorded as complications of labor, but among his effects a single note was later found. No physician could keep her alive. They cut and bled until nothing remained. I shall learn what they did not. He withdrew from society for months. When his shop reopened, his grief had calcified into purpose. He began ordering chemical manuals from London, written by men who studied the poisons of aconitum and belladonna. He worked late into the night in the small cellar beneath his shop, experimenting first with animals, pigeons, cats, even dogs taken from the alleys of Meeting Street. The townsfolk heard scratching sometimes, but Finch said it was the rats. In those months he made his discovery: a tincture of aconitum, when mixed with warm oil and applied to a small wound, entered the bloodstream quietly. The victim first felt a tightening in the chest, then dizziness, then calm. Death came hours later, the face serene, the heart stilled. There were no marks, no odor, no sign. Finch recorded his findings in the same ledger where he wrote his client lists. In proper measure, it mirrors sleep. By summer's end, he was using his tincture not only on animals. He had found his method of vengeance, and his victims would never know it. A few drops disguised beneath the scent of bay rum or rose water, nothing more. When Mr. Armitage died of a sudden seizure days after visiting the shop, no one questioned it. When Captain Ransom, a shipping magnate, was found lifeless in his parlor that autumn, the doctor wrote heart failure and moved on. Both men had been shaved by Finch that same week. Charleston whispered about the bad air, the fever, the will of God. No one suspected the man holding the razor. Finch was the model of propriety. He attended charity dinners, gave small coins to the church's widow fund, and contributed to the Mechanics' Society. He never drank or gambled. He greeted his neighbors with a nod and never raised his voice. In Charleston, appearance was virtue, and Finch's appearance was flawless. But in his ledgers, the mask fell away. He kept records of every ingredient, every reaction, every tremor of the hand. He noted which victims were weak of heart, who had debts, who deserved release. He wrote of it as though it were a service, an act of balance. He began to believe that some men's deaths were not crimes, but corrections. The barber shop became his theater of justice. As the razor's edge kissed the throat, he would steady his hand, dip the cloth, and whisper in his mind a silent benediction. When the man left, he watched him walk away through the window, counting the steps until he disappeared from view. The deaths continued, quiet, random, scattered over months. Judge Loughton's clerk, the apothecary's supplier, a sea captain. 17 in total between 1849 and 1853, all attributed to natural causes. No pattern, no scandal. Only a city too polite to question coincidence, and in that politeness lay Finch's perfect shield. Those who later studied his records would note that his victims shared one thing in common. Each had crossed, cheated, or spoken against him in small ways. A delayed payment, an insult, a careless remark about his wife's death. Each was written off as an unfortunate but natural loss. Finch's shop prospered. He hired an assistant, a boy of 17 named Thomas Gray, who swept the floor and learned the trade. To him, Finch was meticulous but fair. Yet even the boy noticed the strange smell that sometimes drifted from the cellar and the small glass vials Finch kept locked away. The city carried on. Ships came and went, fortunes rose and fell, and behind the door of 31 Meeting Street, the man with the razor perfected the art of killing without a trace. The world above saw only his respectability. The world below, sealed in ledgers and dust, would one day tell another story. And that story, hidden for generations, begins with the day a boy named Thomas Gray looked too closely at the wrong notebook. By the summer of 1850, Elias Finch's reputation had grown beyond Meeting Street. Wealthy planters travelling from the country made appointments weeks in advance, and naval officers passing through Charleston spoke of the barber with the surgeon's hand. To sit in Finch's chair was a mark of refinement. His silence inspired trust, his precision, admiration. Yet, beneath the scent of rosewater and bay rum, there lingered another fragrance, sharp, metallic, faintly sweet. Among the few who noticed was Thomas Gray, the apprentice he had taken on a year before. Gray was barely 17, a wiry boy with a steady gaze and an eagerness that bordered on reverence. He had lost his father to the river docks and saw in Finch not merely an employer but a model of composure and intellect. Finch, in turn, treated the boy with strict formality, neither cruel nor kind, speaking in clipped sentences that left little room for familiarity. Thomas's duties were simple: sweep the floor, polish the razors, boil the towels, and maintain the small garden of herbs behind the shop. But as months passed, he began to sense that there was something hidden beneath the order of the place. Finch spent long nights in the cellar, emerging only when the oil lamps above had burned out. The locks on the cabinets were new, the keys always on his person. And there were the smells, the sourness of tinctures, the sharp tang of metal filings, and something else he could not name, like flowers left too long in water. On the morning of August 9th, a well-known lawyer named Mr. David Trowbridge came in for a shave. Finch greeted him with the usual composure, draped the white cloth around his neck, and began the ritual. Thomas watched from the corner, sharpening scissors on the whetstone. The conversation was ordinary: weather, politics, the new railway extending toward Columbia. Yet as Finch leaned close, Thomas noticed his hand dip briefly into a small glass vial on the counter, brushing its contents onto the towel before pressing it to the client's face. The movement was so subtle that only an attentive eye could have seen it. Trowbridge left in high spirits, tipping the barber generously. 2 days later, the man collapsed at his desk and died before help could reach him. The doctor pronounced apoplexy. The family accepted the verdict with sorrow but no suspicion. Thomas, however, remembered the vial. He said nothing, but from that day forward, he began to watch his master with quiet dread. Late one night in October, while Finch attended a meeting of the Mechanics' Society, Thomas crept into the shop to retrieve his forgotten coat. A candle still burned faintly on the counter, its flame quivering in the draught. He saw that the key to the cellar had been left in the lock. The temptation, he would later write in a letter found decades afterward, was as irresistible as hunger. The stairs descended into cool darkness. The air smelled of damp stone and vinegar. Against one wall stood shelves lined with jars, some filled with liquids of deep amber, others with cloudy sediment. A table in the center held notebooks stacked in uneven piles, and beside them a small iron cage containing the remains of what had once been a cat. Thomas opened one of the notebooks. The first pages contained lists of names and dates. Then, as he turned further, the handwriting grew smaller, tighter, almost feverish. April the 2nd, Subject 4, administered tincture diluted in warm oil, pulse weakened within hour, subject expired without distress, face calm. June the 5th, Subject 8, mixture effective through superficial abrasion, faster absorption. July 11th, Trowbridge to be tested upon next appointment, must reduce measure by half to avoid suspicion. Thomas felt his skin prickle. He turned more pages, unable to stop. There were sketches of human anatomy, throats, veins, hearts drawn with unsettling precision. There were notes on chemical reactions, lists of ingredients, calculations written over and over until the paper tore from pressure. Then he found a single line underlined twice. Each death cleanses the air of this city. The boy staggered back, knocking over a jar. The sharp odor of alcohol filled the cellar. He fled up the stairs, locking the door behind him, heart hammering. For 2 days, Thomas avoided the shop, feigning illness. When he returned, Finch regarded him with a look that seemed to pierce through his excuses. The barber's politeness remained, but the stillness behind his eyes had deepened into something colder. "Curiosity," Finch said quietly one evening as they cleaned the razors, "is the first sin of the idle mind. It leads men into graves as surely as the blade." Thomas said nothing. The following weeks passed in tense silence. Finch worked methodically, humming under his breath while clients came and went. He seemed aware that Thomas had seen too much, but rather than confrontation, he chose patience. He had always preferred slow endings. That winter, the boy's health began to fail. It started with dizziness. He assumed it was fatigue from long hours, but soon his fingers tingled, his speech slurred, and a dull ache settled behind his eyes. Finch noticed. He insisted Thomas take tonics of his own preparation, restoratives, he called them, mixed with honey and laudanum. Thomas drank them dutifully, desperate for relief. The symptoms worsened. His hands trembled. He struggled to stand. His skin grew pale and cold, and his vision blurred. One night he collapsed in the alley behind the shop. Neighbors carried him to Dr. Horatio Venn, whose apothecary shared the wall next door. The doctor examined him and concluded it was a nervous fever, likely from exhaustion or bad air. He prescribed rest and broth. Finch visited daily, bringing small bottles of medicine. Witnesses later recalled how attentive he was, how kind. He read aloud from scripture by the boy's bedside and promised him recovery. Within a week, Thomas Gray was dead. The death certificate read, "Nervous exhaustion compounded by fever." No inquiry was made. The city was full of such deaths that year. No one saw reason to doubt. Finch paid for the funeral, stood solemnly beside the coffin, and pressed a coin into the mother's trembling hand. Those who attended remarked upon his composure, his quiet grief. Yet there were whispers. A servant from the apothecary claimed to have seen Finch carry away one of Thomas's shirts before burial. Another swore he had seen the barber digging in the garden at midnight, though he could not say why. The boy's grave, unmarked and modest, would later be found disturbed, its soil uneven, the coffin lid scratched from within. In the months following Thomas Gray's death, Finch's journals grew darker. His entries became shorter, fragmented, filled with biblical phrases twisted into something else. "The wages of deceit are peace. They come to me proud, they leave me pure." He began recording his observations of symptoms not as medical phenomena, but as choreography. Tremor begins at the hand, ascends the arm and settles near the heart, lips pale, breath short, silence absolute. By now, the pattern of death among his clients had drawn faint murmurs within Charleston's polite society. Too many prominent men had fallen too quickly, all of them known to visit Finch's shop. But the city's respect for hierarchy outweighed its curiosity. To accuse a barber, a tradesman, of such crimes against the elite would have been unthinkable. Doctors muttered of the mid-air, of bad spirits, of unseen contagions. The ledgers of mortality filled quietly, and the shutters of Meeting Street closed each night as if in agreement. Only one man, a visiting journalist from Savannah named Caleb Mercer, took note. He had come to Charleston in 1851 to write about the yellow fever epidemic, and heard from a port worker of the strange coincidences surrounding the barber's clientele. Mercer, pragmatic and skeptical, dismissed it at first as superstition. But after learning that Thomas Gray's death had gone unexplained, he began to inquire discreetly. When Mercer requested to interview Finch for his column, the barber obliged. Their meeting took place on a warm afternoon in April. Finch received him in the shop, impeccably polite, answering each question with calm deliberation. Mercer later described the encounter in a surviving draft found in his effects. The man's demeanor was that of one who has nothing to hide. His eyes, though steady, reflected no warmth. There was precision even in his breathing. I confessed to a faint unease, as though I sat in the presence of someone measuring me. 2 days after the interview, Mercer fell violently ill. He was confined to his boarding room, delirious, convinced he had contracted the fever he had come to report on. His editor sent word to his family in Georgia. He died before the letter reached them. The barber's name appeared nowhere in the coroner's notes. Years later, when Charleston archivists rediscovered Finch's ledger, they found Mercer's name written in the margin beside a simple mark, a cross. By 1853, 17 names bore the same mark, 17 lives erased by a man who believed himself unseen, and for nearly 70 years that belief held true. But the truth, like the tincture he mixed with such care, does not disappear. It lingers in ledgers, in graves, in the silence of those who chose not to speak. When the files were unsealed in 1912, the handwriting had faded, but one final note remained legible on the last page. Thomas knew too much. Curiosity kills quicker than aconite. By the spring of 1851, Elias Finch had become an institution. His shop on Meeting Street was no longer merely a barber's chair, but a meeting place for Charleston's upper caste. Gentlemen stopped in not only for grooming, but for counsel, for rumour, for reassurance that the order of things remained intact. Finch listened, nodded, and served. His silence was a luxury in itself. Those who could afford discretion came to him for it. The deaths that followed were spaced carefully, never too close together, never in ways that might stir alarm. Each appeared natural: fever, seizure, heart failure. The city physician, Dr. Venn, signed the certificates without question. The system worked because it depended upon trust, and trust was the one thing Finch never failed to earn. There were those who quietly wondered why misfortune seemed to shadow the same circle of men: a merchant who cheated his partners, a magistrate who accepted bribes, a ship captain rumored to have trafficked in human cargo, all dead within months of one another. But the rumors never reached the courthouse. Charleston preferred its sins unspoken. Finch's methods had refined to precision. The aconitum mixture was now only one of several tinctures in his private collection. He experimented with digitalis, extracted from foxglove, with mercury sublimate disguised in hair tonics, and with tinctures of laudanum balanced just shy of lethality. His records, later recovered from beneath the floorboards, showed an almost clinical fascination with dosage and effect. He wrote as a physician might, describing the dying not as victims but as subjects. Subject 23, heart rate diminished predictably, perspiration minimal, expiration without struggle. Subject 25 displayed agitation, required larger measure. Duration, 2 hours, 14 minutes. He measured everything: the pulse, the tremor, the time between last breath and stillness. Suppose he was mapping the boundaries between science and murder, and the city, through its silence, gave him permission. Charleston in those years was a place of contradictions, a city proud of its refinement yet dependent on cruelty. The enslaved outnumbered the free, yet no one spoke of fear. Disease ravaged the alleys while the drawing rooms glittered with imported crystal. In that world, death was common enough to go unexamined. Finch understood this perfectly. He moved through society like a shadow that cast no outline. Among his clients were men who built fortunes from the slave trade, and it is here that his motivations grow darker still. There are passages in his journals, written in ink now nearly invisible, where he speaks of balance, of justice rendered without jury. Some historians argue that Finch saw himself as an instrument of correction, avenging his wife's death by punishing the city's hypocrisy. Others believe it was simpler, that he had come to savor the power of choosing who lived and who did not. Whatever the reason, by the early 1850s his killings had become deliberate, patterned. He began keeping a separate ledger, marked only with the letter R on its cover. Inside were names arranged in columns, each followed by brief annotations. H.S. Cruel to servants, L.C. Embezzlement proved, will not be missed. J.L., unfaithful to wife, arrogant beyond measure. The ledger was less a record than a list of judgments. One by one, the names were crossed out in the same careful hand. No man kills alone for long. Around Finch gathered a small circle of enablers, though none fully grasped the scale of what he had done. The first was Dr. Horatio Venn, the apothecary next door, who supplied Finch with certain ingredients under the pretense of medical experiment. Venn was a nervous man, dependent on the patronage of Charleston's wealthy, and he chose not to ask questions. When the barber requested compounds of mercury or extracts of belladonna, the doctor signed the invoices quietly. Later in his letters, Venn would insist that he assumed it was for the mixing of perfumes. The second was Mr. Albert Croft, a lawyer who managed several estates in the city and in time became Finch's silent ally. Croft was a man of calculation, sharp-featured, discreet and ambitious. It is said that Finch first saved him from scandal by destroying certain letters left behind by a deceased client. From that day, Croft's loyalty was assured. He provided Finch with information about men whose deaths might go unnoticed or even prove convenient to others. It was Croft who drew up the falsified wills that redirected small inheritances to Finch for services rendered. The third, most reluctant, was Joseph Lamb, a freedman who worked as Finch's night porter. Lamb had been enslaved on a plantation outside Somerville before purchasing his freedom. He had a wife and 2 children and was grateful for the work. He kept his head down, his voice low. But he saw things: the jars in the cellar, the packages sent in secret to Croft's office, the stains that no amount of washing could remove from the towels. Years later, when he spoke to a local preacher on his deathbed, Lamb described the basement of the barber shop as a place where the air never moved. The killings continued with mechanical regularity. Colonel Shaw, who had once dismissed Finch's wife's suffering as God's lesson in humility, died in his sleep after complaining of dizziness. Finch attended his wake, offering condolences to the widow. Weeks later, a merchant named Lionel Cobb fell ill following a routine haircut. Within 3 days, he was gone. Another mark crossed from the ledger. To the city's physicians, the deaths seemed part of a wider epidemic. The fever that haunted Charleston every summer gave them all the explanation they required. No one examined the bodies closely. Even had they done so, the evidence would have been invisible. The conspiracy of silence was not orchestrated, it was cultural. Each man feared scandal more than truth. To admit that someone among them, a tradesman, had mastered the art of undetectable murder would have been to invite chaos into their fragile hierarchy. So the silence deepened, and Finch thrived within it. By 1852, Finch had expanded his operations beyond the barber's chair. Through Croft's connections, he began visiting certain estates under the pretext of offering medical services to aging planters who distrusted physicians. He carried with him his own mixtures, tonics, balms, and oils that promised relief from gout, tremors, and sleeplessness. Several of those men would die within the year, their fortunes quietly redirected through altered documents. One widow, Mrs. Eliza Shaw, later told her sister that the barber's visits brought her husband great calm. He slept as though in peace for the first time in years. She died 6 months later of the same mysterious stillness. Finch's precision extended to the disposal of evidence. The used cloths were burned, the razors cleaned with vinegar, the vials emptied into the earth beneath his herb garden. The plants thrived in soil that would later test high in mercury content. The journals from this period are filled with an almost poetic detachment. He referred to himself not by name, but as the hand. The hand administers. The hand corrects. The hand leaves no stain. There are references, too, to the project, a word whose meaning remains unclear. Some scholars suggest it referred to his long-term plan of perfecting a method of silent death. Others believe it was something larger, an attempt to cleanse the social order he despised. The final phase of his work began in 1853 when the first whispers of suspicion reached the courthouse. An undertaker named Matthew Dillard noted peculiar stiffness in several of Finch's deceased clients. Bodies too rigid, their faces unnaturally serene. Dillard mentioned this to Dr. Venn, who dismissed it as a peculiarity of the fever. But Venn himself had begun to fear the barber's calm. He confided to a colleague that Finch spoke of death as though it were a friend who visited politely. That same week, Venn's apprentice found him dead in his study, an overturned cup beside his hand. The coroner ruled heart failure. Finch attended the funeral and placed a small bouquet of foxglove upon the coffin. The deaths of Venn and Dillard effectively silenced further inquiry. The pattern dissolved into the background noise of a city used to loss. But not everyone remained quiet. Among the papers of a Charleston journalist named Edwin Fallow, discovered in 1871, is a fragment of a letter that appears to describe an attempted investigation. Fallow claimed to have approached Mr. Croft with inquiries regarding the barber's affairs and was warned that some truths in Charleston are not meant to be recorded. Within months, Fallow had left the city, abandoning his career. His final note reads simply, "The man of Meeting Street walks unjudged. The system protects its own." By the outbreak of the Civil War, Elias Finch was an old man, grey-haired but steady-handed. His shop had survived fires, epidemics, and economic collapse. Many of his former clients were dead. Their sons now sat in his chair. He served soldiers on leave, Confederate officers, and wounded men seeking comfort in ritual. The razor still glided, the towel still steamed. No one questioned that he had outlived them all. He wrote less in those years, though the few surviving pages reveal a mind untouched by remorse. "The world is sick. I offer cure. To remove rot is mercy." His accomplice, Croft, died mysteriously in 1863, his body found slumped over his desk, an uncapped inkwell beside him. The handwriting on his final legal document was Finch's. In the aftermath of the war, records vanished. The courthouse archives burned in 1865. Property deeds were lost, wills destroyed. Finch disappeared from census lists altogether. Some claimed he moved inland. Others said he was seen boarding a ship bound for Nassau under another name. The truth would remain uncertain for decades. But the pattern he created, the blending of respectability and death, would echo long after his chair fell empty. When the renovations of 1912 revealed the sealed chest beneath the courthouse, the archivists who opened it were confronted with a meticulous system of evil. 17 ledgers, arranged by year, each filled with the same tight handwriting, each marked with the same phrase on its final page, "The hand leaves no stain." That was the legacy of Elias Finch, the barber who weaponized trust itself, who turned civility into camouflage. Charleston, polite and pious, had built the perfect cage for him to operate within, and in that cage for nearly 20 years he rewrote the boundaries of murder until even the city's conscience forgot the sound of protest. By 1861, Charleston was no longer the gilded city of polite whispers and cobblestone streets. The drumbeats of war echoed from every corner. Men once seated in Finch's chair now marched to battlefields in Virginia and Georgia, leaving widows and estates in disarray. The city itself became a theater of tension. Homes shuttered, merchants worried over the blockade of the harbor, and the air thick with rumors of Union advances. In this upheaval, the steady rhythm of Elias Finch's life began to falter. The first disruption came in the winter of 1862. The Union naval blockade tightened, preventing the regular shipment of imported chemicals Finch relied upon. Tinctures and powders dwindled, and he was forced to improvise with local herbs and compounds of uneven potency. A miscalculation led to a subtle but perceptible difference in effect. A client, Colonel James Hilliard, experienced extreme agitation and convulsions that left a faint scar on his neck before death. Though the city physicians attributed it to typhoid or overindulgence in spirits, Finch noted the incident in his ledger with unusual care. Deviation noted, control diminished, adjust formula, avoid haste. Even in those months, Finch continued his work with quiet precision, but the chaos of war brought new threats. Houses were abandoned, estates pillaged, and old allies disappeared. Joseph Lamb, the former porter who had witnessed too much, fled Charleston in fear for his family's safety. Dr. Horatio Venn had died years before, and Croft's mysterious death left no one to consult on legal manipulations. The barber now worked alone, and the city's shifting social order left him vulnerable in ways he had never been before. In the spring of 1863, a strange series of events began to unfold. Witnesses later recorded that Finch was seen leaving Meeting Street under cover of darkness, often carrying small satchels or packages. Some claimed to have glimpsed him near the edges of the city, in alleys abandoned by merchants and traders, speaking quietly to figures who vanished at the first hint of light. The nature of these interactions remains unknown, though speculation in surviving journals suggests he may have been seeking replacements for his chemical supplies or preparing for something larger. The first clear sign of reckoning arrived with the arrival of Union forces along the Charleston perimeter. Soldiers occupied abandoned estates, requisitioned supplies, and scrutinized the population with suspicion. Finch's discretion was no longer sufficient. A young Union officer, Captain Samuel Whitmore, noted the unusual mortality among Charleston's elite during his inspection of the city's civil records. Whitmore requested access to obituaries and death certificates spanning the previous 15 years, suspecting cholera, typhoid, or fever as the culprit. When city officials hesitated, citing lost or destroyed documents, Whitmore grew curious and persistent. Elias Finch, sensing scrutiny closing in, began to withdraw from the city entirely. Local gossip whispered of his final appointments: Judge Loughton, a now aged but still influential figure, and Mr. Samuel Armitage's surviving son. Both men had received meticulous care at Finch's hands, and by mid-1864 neither had survived the year. Local papers simply noted unexpected illness or natural causes. Finch's ledger, the final surviving volume, ceased entries abruptly in October 1864, leaving no explanation. Accounts diverge on what happened next. Some claimed Finch fled southward along the coastal waterways, taking refuge in small ports of Georgia and Florida. Others swore he remained in Charleston, hiding in the attics or cellars of abandoned estates. One widely circulated story, preserved in the memoirs of a former servant, claimed that Finch met his end in the summer of 1864 during an accidental collapse of a hidden cellar beneath a derelict warehouse on King Street. The account describes the discovery of his body months later, pinned beneath fallen beams, a final vial of powdered aconite crushed beneath his hand. Local authorities, weary of war and chaos, recorded his death simply as unknown male, and the ledger was secretly removed to city archives. Other theories hold that Finch did not die at all. One fragmentary note, found in a journal belonging to a minor clerk in the Charleston Registry Office, implies he escaped by boat under an alias, carrying with him enough chemical knowledge to continue his work elsewhere. These reports, though tantalizing, lack corroboration. What is certain is that with Finch's disappearance, the quiet system he had built began to unravel. The aftermath of his downfall was swift and grim. Many of his clients' families experienced additional misfortune. Estates changed hands unexpectedly, debts surfaced that had been hidden, and several associates of Finch, including minor clerks and former apprentices, were found dead under circumstances described as accidents or illness. The patterns of the past persisted even as the architect of them vanished. Children of the deceased, particularly those of Thomas Gray and Joseph Lamb's family, later reported unusual illnesses and unsettling dreams of being trapped or buried alive. Oral traditions passed quietly through Charleston neighborhoods spoke of the barber who killed with kindness, a figure who haunted the city's collective memory even in his absence. Finch's own property was left abandoned for decades. The shop at 31 Meeting Street fell into ruin, its windows boarded and the leather chair left to decay. When a fire swept part of Charleston in 1871, the shop's upper floors collapsed, sealing the cellar in rubble. It was here, beneath bricks and dust, that the first fragments of his ledgers were rediscovered during renovations in 1912, revealing the meticulous records of his victims, the formulas of his poison, and the precise chronology of 17 confirmed deaths. The discovery prompted limited investigation, though authorities, constrained by the influence of surviving prominent families, largely suppressed the findings. Newspaper accounts of the time noted that curious volumes had been found but offered no further detail, and the public remained unaware of the full scope of Finch's actions. It was as if the city itself had conspired to bury the truth alongside the barber, his victims, and his loyal accomplices. Those who survived the era, widows, servants, and distant relatives, carried with them fragments of the horror. Their recollections, when collected decades later by historians, revealed common threads: scratches inside coffins, the sudden disappearance of children from households, the calm of those who would shortly die. Some spoke of waking to faint chemical odors lingering in abandoned rooms, of rooms cold in summer, of the oppressive sensation of being watched, even when no one was present. By the close of the Civil War, Charleston had endured military defeat, social upheaval, and the liberation of the enslaved. Yet the shadow of Elias Finch remained, lingering in the memory of those who had glimpsed it. His system, a network of precision, secrecy, and manipulation, had left an indelible mark. The city had survived, but the pattern he established persisted quietly in the records and in the whispers of those who had lived through it. The final reckoning, in truth, was never public. Justice had been rendered, not in a courtroom, but in the slow erosion of his network, in the decay of his property, and in the whispers that ensured no one would ever again occupy the same space with the same blind trust. The ledger, rediscovered decades later, confirmed what many had suspected. Elias Finch had been the architect of death itself, a man who used the veneer of civility to mask a methodical, terrifying genius. And yet some fragments of his presence lingered. Archaeologists and historians who examined the Meeting Street site in the early 20th century found vials buried beneath the garden, empty but for traces of their former contents. Coffins in neglected cemeteries bore faint scratches on the interior, suggesting that some victims had struggled against premature burial. Oral tradition, preserved by generations, spoke of the barber whose hand brought stillness, and the tales carried a warning. Even the most respectable figure might conceal horrors beneath a calm exterior. By the end of his life, wherever it truly ended, Elias Finch had succeeded in creating a system that the city itself failed to detect. 17 confirmed victims, countless others suspected, a network of enablers, complicit or intimidated, ensuring secrecy, and a ledger that, when finally unearthed, revealed both the precision and the cruelty of a man whose outward civility hid a slow, deliberate terror. In Charleston, the quiet streets continued to host life, commerce, and laughter. The harbor shimmered in the sun, the palmettos swayed in gentle breezes, and visitors saw only beauty. But beneath that calm, beneath the polished floors and crumbling courthouses, remained the echo of 17 deaths, the meticulous hand of a barber who had mastered the art of disappearing while delivering death. Decades passed. Charleston rebuilt itself after the fires, the blockade, and the destruction of war. The city transformed, yet the streets retained their old names, their cobblestones echoing the footsteps of generations. The grand houses of Meeting Street were restored or replaced, yet even the most polished facades could not entirely hide the layers of history beneath. Among these layers, the memory of Elias Finch, the barber who had weaponized trust, slumbered, waiting for rediscovery. The first official rediscovery occurred in the early 1920s. During renovations at a long-abandoned building on Meeting Street, workmen unearthed a small iron chest beneath a collapsed floorboard in what had once been a back room. Inside were meticulously preserved ledgers, yellowed with age, the ink faint but legible. Each page was filled with the tight, precise handwriting of Elias Finch, chronicling names, dates, and the details of his chemical experiments. The entries catalogued victims with an almost clinical detachment, noting reactions to various mixtures, the progression of symptoms, and the precise moment of death. Among the ledgers were also fragments of letters, some addressed to Dr. Horatio Venn, others to Albert Croft, suggesting a correspondence regarding supplies, timing, and methods. Small vials, long emptied but still intact, lay scattered among the pages. Some contained residue of aconitum and mercury compounds, others traces of laudanum and belladonna. Botanists later confirmed that the soil in the small garden plot behind the shop retained elevated concentrations of heavy metals, likely the remnants of Finch's experiments. Despite the sensational nature of the find, the rediscovery was quietly suppressed. Local authorities, many descended from the families of Finch's victims or his surviving clients, intervened. Newspaper reports were vague, mentioning only archival documents of a former tradesman or old ledgers of minor historical interest. No public examination of the vials or ledgers occurred. Scholars who attempted to investigate were subtly discouraged. Access to the documents was restricted. Letters from the time hint that descendants feared scandal would tarnish family reputations if Finch's systematic killings became widely known. Nevertheless, fragments of the story persisted. Oral traditions, passed down by servants, laborers, and children of the era, kept the memory alive. Accounts varied. Some recalled hearing the faint hiss of a heated iron in the night, the smell of chemicals wafting from a cellar, or the sudden, unexplained death of a prominent gentleman shortly after visiting the shop. Others spoke of scratching noises within coffins, of children who had vanished or fallen ill mysteriously, or of the stillness of men who seemed unusually peaceful in their final moments. Though inconsistent, these recollections shared a common thread: the fear of a quiet, calculating presence operating behind the city's veneer of civility. By the 1930s, interest among historians and journalists grew. A small group of academics managed to access parts of the Finch collection in Charleston's archives. They found evidence of both meticulous planning and systematic cruelty, the chemical experiments, the ledger of 17 victims, and even diagrams showing the precise method of administering tinctures through the barber's chair. Footnotes in their papers reference unpublished letters, fragments of journals, and observations by workmen who had stumbled across buried vials decades earlier. Yet official acknowledgement remained muted. For every historian who attempted to publish, influential families threatened lawsuits or leveraged their positions to block dissemination. The city's narrative preferred the image of Charleston as a genteel, honorable place, unwilling to confront the shadow that had once thrived there. Finch's crimes, despite the overwhelming evidence, were treated as anecdotal curiosities rather than documented history. In the mid-20th century, further investigations were made by private scholars, particularly in the 1940s and 1950s. These researchers located fragments of Finch's personal notes in the records of a Savannah shipping office and correspondence between Croft and other Charleston lawyers. They discovered subtle patterns in death certificates, repeated mentions of nervous exhaustion, apoplexy, or natural causes corresponding to the timeline of Finch's operations. Each entry aligned almost perfectly with his ledger's recorded dates. Historians later noted that 17 confirmed deaths appeared systematically over a period of 15 years, all linked to men of influence who had visited 31 Meeting Street. Physical evidence corroborated the oral histories. Archaeologists documented scratched coffins in cemeteries used for both servants and elite families. Some coffins contained faint traces of chemicals consistent with aconitum or laudanum. Soil testing around the shop's foundations revealed high concentrations of toxic metals, consistent with decades of hidden experiments. Even the collapsed cellar, now beneath later construction, yielded small remnants of glass vials, iron instruments, and fragments of leather gloves. In addition, descendants of both victims and accomplices reported inexplicable phenomena. Children claimed to feel an oppressive presence near Meeting Street. Adults described nightmares in which the Zagantes were restrained or buried alive. One family preserved a journal recording the experience of a servant who awoke to find a client's corpse unnaturally still, noting the eerie calm and the whisper of a voice promising care. Across decades, these anecdotes coalesced into a cautious local lore. The city's past contained shadows not entirely extinguished. By the 1960s, academics studying Southern urban history began referencing Finch in passing, though always with caution. The barber's methods, precise, slow, and undetectable, were framed as curiosity rather than malevolence, Textbooks on medicine or criminology occasionally cited him as an example of early experimental toxicology without acknowledging the intentionality or the systematic cruelty behind the deaths. The suppression of evidence, both formal and social, meant that the broader public remained unaware of the scale of the horror. Even today, the echoes persist. The site of Finch's shop has long since been repurposed. The block now hosts modern businesses, their glass facades reflecting Charleston's bustling streets. Yet beneath the polished floors, foundations and soil, remnants of the past linger. Vials may have decayed, ledgers may have been lost or hidden, but the faint traces of chemical residues, the stories whispered by descendants, and the scratched coffins remain as testimony. Local historians report that even decades after rediscovery, some ledgers remain sealed under court orders, held by families determined to protect their reputations. Some scholars argue that the story of Elias Finch is an enduring lesson. Civility can conceal malevolence, trust can mask cruelty, and historical records, even meticulous ones, can be suppressed if they threaten the social order. The Barber's work, methodical and deliberate, demonstrates how a single individual, given skill, intelligence, and opportunity, can orchestrate terror for decades while remaining ostensibly respectable. The rediscovery of his ledgers, vials, and correspondence in the 20th century confirmed what oral tradition had long hinted. 17 men of influence died under circumstances manipulated by a single tradesman. Children were witnesses or indirect victims. Apprentices like Thomas Gray were silenced. Accomplices, willing or coerced, ensured the continuity of secrecy. And yet, even with modern science and archival methods, many questions remain unresolved. Did Finch truly die in Charleston, or did he escape? Were there additional victims whose names were never recorded? Did other accomplices operate beyond the records? The final reckoning is elusive. Modern Charleston bears no visible mark of Elias Finch's deeds, yet his legacy endures invisibly. The site of 31 Meeting Street, though bustling with contemporary commerce, carries layers of history beneath its floors. Local oral tradition continues to preserve the memory of the barber whose hand brought quiet death, who moved through polite society with precision, and whose careful records were hidden beneath dust and silence. Scholars and investigators who uncover fragments report an unshakable sense of unease, as if the meticulous presence of a man who once controlled life and death still lingers. Even now, the archivists, historians, and families who have touched Finch's records describe a chill that cannot be explained by old ink or crumbling paper. Letters, vials, and scratch marks bear witness to acts that were both deliberate and methodical. The shadow of his work, like the chemical traces buried in soil, remains a quiet testament to human cruelty. And so the story ends, or perhaps only pauses. Some secrets buried in Charleston, in its cobblestone streets, its crumbling courthouses, and its hidden cellars, may never be fully revealed. The barber's hand, though absent, continues to write in the spaces between history and memory, a silent record of 17 confirmed deaths and countless unseen consequences. The city itself bears witness, in its quiet streets, to a horror that thrived behind civility, waiting for discovery. What do you think of this story? Was everything truly revealed? Leave your thoughts below, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.